Yeah, the thing I find most tricky is when people don't recognize you particularly, but half recognize you.
For decades, the world laughed at a man who barely spoke a word. He fumbled through church pews, wrestled with turkeys stuck on his head, and turned a simple swimming pool trip into chaos. Mr. Bean made more than 200 countries laugh without needing a single line of dialogue translated. But behind that rubbery, silent face was a man who spent most of his life hiding something far more serious. And at 70 years old, Rowan Atkinson has finally stopped hiding it. What we all suspected for years, watching him wince through interviews and slip away from cameras the moment filming stopped, turns out to be true. The laughter cost him more than anyone realized. Rowan Sebastian Atkinson was born on January 6, 1955, in the small village of Consett, County Durham, in the north of England. He was the youngest of 4 brothers, raised on a working farm by a father who ran a cattle and sheep operation and expected his sons to be practical, disciplined, and unremarkable in the best sense of the word. There was nothing show business about the Atkinson household. It was quiet, rural, and rooted in hard work, which makes it all the stranger that one of its sons would grow up to become one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. As a child, Rowan developed a pronounced stutter. It surfaced when he was young and stayed with him well into adulthood, resurfacing especially under pressure, in job interviews, on live radio, in front of unfamiliar audiences. At school, other children didn't always understand what they were looking at. A shy, awkward boy with an unusual, elastic face and a voice that sometimes refused to cooperate. He was an easy target, and he was bullied for it. What nobody could have predicted was that this same unusual face and body would one day become his greatest professional asset. On stage, playing someone else, something shifted. The stutter loosened its grip. When Rowan stopped being Rowan and became a character, the words came easier, sometimes disappearing as an obstacle entirely. It was an almost accidental discovery that performance could be a kind of shelter. Academically, Atkinson was sharp. He excelled in the sciences and went on to study electrical and electronic engineering at Newcastle University, graduating in the mid-1970s. From there, he continued his education at the Queen's College, Oxford, pursuing a master's degree in engineering, focusing on control systems, dense, technical material with no obvious connection to comedy at all. He was, by most outward signs, on track to become an engineer or an academic. Nobody in his lecture halls expected the quiet postgraduate student to end up performing in front of hundreds of millions of people. Oxford changed everything, not because of what happened in the classroom, but because of what happened in the drama societies on the side. Rowan started performing in student reviews, and it was there that he met a young writer named Richard Curtis, who would go on to become one of Britain's most successful screenwriters. Curtis has described watching Atkinson perform for the first time and being stunned, not by a loud, brash comic energy, but by something quieter and stranger, a kind of physical precision and comic timid quite as easy for him to love back. And that seemed to come from nowhere. The two began writing and performing together, and in 1976 they took a show to the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, the proving ground for so much of British comedy. It was a turning point. Atkinson was no longer just an engineering student with a hobby. He had found the thing he was actually built for. The years that followed weren't a smooth rise. Atkinson attempted early radio and television projects that mostly went nowhere, including sketch pilots that networks passed on. He faced repeated rejection, and by his own account, this period was genuinely difficult, a stretch where his stutter would flare under the stress of auditions and where self-doubt crept in. But he kept working, kept performing live, and kept refining a comic style built less on wordplay and more on the body, exaggerated expressions, rubbery physicality, and a mastery of silence that few comedians of his generation attempted. His breakthrough came in 1979 with Not the 9 O'Clock News, a satirical BBC sketch show that also starred Pamela Stephenson, Mel Smith, and Griff Rhys-Jones. The first episode landed to a muted and even hostile response. Some critics dismissed it outright. But the show found its footing over subsequent series, becoming one of the defining British comedy programs of its era and winning a BAFTA along the way. It also gave Atkinson his first real platform to demonstrate what he could do without relying on his voice. Elaborate physical sketches where a raised eyebrow or badly timed blink did more comedic work than a page of dialogue. From there came Blackadder, a historical sitcom he co-created with Richard Curtis that ran, in various incarnations, from 1983 through 1989. The first series was an expensive, sprawling production shot on location, and it struggled critically and financially, so much so that the BBC came close to not renewing it. A leaner, sharper reinvention followed for the second series, moving the action almost entirely into interior sets and tightening the writing with the addition of Ben Elton. It worked. Blackadder 2, and the seasons that followed, became a showcase for a different kind of Atkinson performance, verbal, sarcastic, and razor-witted, a contrast to the near-silent physical comedy he'd become known for. The final series, Blackadder Goes Forth, set in the trenches of the First World War, is still regarded as one of the great achievements of British television comedy, genuinely funny and genuinely moving in its final moments, a combination that's much harder to pull off than it looks. But it's a different character, born quietly out of his Oxford years and fully realized in 1990, that made Rowan Atkinson a household name everywhere on Earth. Mr. Bean required almost no dialogue at all, which meant it required no translation either. A man in a tweed jacket, driving a tiny green Mini, getting into increasingly absurd trouble with the most mundane tasks imaginable. Going swimming, decorating for Christmas, sitting an exam. It didn't matter what language you spoke. The show became a genuine global phenomenon, syndicated across the world and beloved in places as far apart as Latin America and East Asia. The 1997 feature film Bean turned that popularity into serious box office numbers, becoming one of the most commercially successful comedies to come out of Britain up to that point, and a sequel, Mr. Bean's Holiday, followed a decade later. Here is where the story turns, though, and it's the part of Atkinson's life that took the longest for him to speak about honestly. For years, in scattered interviews, Atkinson admitted something that seemed to contradict everything the character represented. Playing Mr. Bean, he said, was not fun. It was, in his own words, exhausting, physically and emotionally draining in a way that his other roles never were. Because the character communicated almost entirely through expression and movement, every single moment of screen time demanded total physical commitment. Elaborate stunts, repeated takes of the same contorted expression, hours of sustained, exaggerated body language with no dialogue to break up the strain. Atkinson has said plainly that he found the responsibility of carrying an entire audience's laughter on his face and shoulders, without the crutch of a single spoken line, to be genuinely stressful. More than once over the years he suggested he was ready to retire the character for good, only to walk that back later, then walk it back again. That inconsistency wasn't flakiness. It was a man genuinely torn between a character that had given him everything and a character that quietly wore him down. Atkinson didn't limit himself to Bean and Blackadder. In 1994, he took a small supporting role as a famously nervous vicar in 4 Weddings and a Funeral, fumbling his way through a wedding ceremony in one of the film's most quoted scenes. That same decade, Disney cast him as the voice of Zazu, the anxious Hornbill advisor in The Lion King, a role he reportedly wasn't initially enthusiastic about, given his general reluctance toward voice-only work, but one that became part of one of the highest-grossing animated films ever made. In the 2000s, he built an entirely new franchise around Johnny English, a bumbling secret agent parody that let him combine his physical comedy instincts with the kind of spy movie set pieces he'd grown up watching. The franchise spanned 3 films across nearly 2 decades, with a character evolving to poke fun at everything from Cold War-style espionage to modern cybersurveillance. Away from the screen, Atkinson's personal life has had its own share of upheaval. He married makeup artist Sinatra Sastry in 1990. The two met while working together on Blackadder. They had 2 children and remained married for over 2 decades before separating in 2014, with their divorce finalized the following year. Around the same period, Atkinson's relationship with actress Louise Ford, whom he met while performing on stage together, became public, drawing considerable media attention given the age gap between them. The two welcomed a daughter in 2017, making Atkinson a father again well into his 60s. True to a lifelong pattern, he said very little publicly about any of it, generally treating his private life as exactly that, private. One story from Atkinson's life stands apart from the world of comedy entirely. In 2001, while flying with his family over Kenya in a small private aircraft, the pilot suffered a medical episode mid-flight and lost consciousness. Atkinson, who had no formal pilot training at the time, took the controls and managed to keep the aircraft stable until the pilot came to and was able to bring the plane down safely. It's the kind of detail that doesn't fit the bumbling, hapless image most people associate with him. A reminder that the character and the man have never been the same thing, however much the public sometimes blurred the two. Atkinson has also shown, at various points, that is willing to step into territory far more serious than sketch comedy. In 2012, he addressed Parliament directly on the subject of free speech law, arguing against a provision that criminalized insulting words and behavior, on the grounds that it was too broadly and too easily used to shut down legitimate, if uncomfortable, expression. The speech drew both strong support and sharp criticism, but it contributed to an eventual change in the law. More recently, in 2023, Atkinson, long known as an alien enthusiastic adopter of electric and hybrid vehicles, wrote a widely discussed opinion piece expressing disappointment with parts of the electric vehicle industry, questioning some of the environmental claims made around EV manufacturing and battery production. The piece generated significant pushback from environmental commentators and reignited debate about the broader trade-offs of the EV transition. But it was also, in its own way, consistent with a man who has never been shy about changing his mind in public and taking the criticism that follows. Now, at 70, something has genuinely shifted. Atkinson has slowed his output of the character that made him a legend, largely stepping back from the physically demanding stunt work that been always required. In 2022's Man vs. Bee, a Netflix series that leaned heavily on the same visual comedy style, he acknowledged in interviews that filming had become noticeably harder on his body than it once was, the toll of decades spent throwing himself, quite literally, into physical comedy. What has really changed, though, isn't the work itself. It's the honesty around it. For most of his career, Atkinson kept a fame wall between the performer and the person, rarely letting interviewers pass the surface. In recent years, that wall has come down, just slightly. He's spoken more candidly about the anxiety that shaped his early life, about how performance became both an escape from his stutter and, eventually, its own separate source of pressure, and about how strange it feels to be beloved worldwide for a character he found so difficult to inhabit. That's really the thing so many longtime fans suspected, but could never quite confirm, that the man behind Mr. Bean wasn't simply a natural clown having the time of his life. He was someone who turned a childhood struggle into an extraordinary gift, built a legendary career out of pure physical discipline and craft, and paid a real, private cost for it along the way. At 70, Rowan Atkinson isn't retiring so much as is finally being honest about what all those years of silent comedy actually demanded of him. And in an odd way, that honesty is its own kind of performance. The first one, perhaps, where he isn't hiding behind a character at all. Looking back across nearly 50 years of work, the arc of Atkinson's career tells a story less about instant stardom and more about persistence through repeated failure. A rejected radio pilot here, a cancelled series there, a stuttering audition that nearly convinced him to go back to engineering. Every major success, from Not the 9 O'Clock News to Blackadder to Mr. Bean himself, came only after an earlier version of it had been dismissed, reworked, or nearly abandoned. That pattern says something about who Atkinson actually is beneath the caricature. Not a naturally effortless comic force, but a meticulous, self-critical craftsman who treated comedy the same way he once approached engineering, as a problem to be solved through iteration, precision, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. It also explains why the emotional toll was so real. When your comedy is built on that level of technical control rather than spontaneous charisma, every performance becomes a kind of engineering project in itself, and there's no room to phone it in. That's a demanding way to build a career, And it's exactly the kind of demand that doesn't show up in a highlight reel of pratfalls and raised eyebrows. It shows up, instead, in a 70-year-old man quietly admitting that the character the whole world loved was never